they've said this is the last executive president that Sri Lanka will elect. It's a lovely sound bite, but we're hoping that they will be able to do that.
Hi, you've tuned into State of South Asia, a podcast from Himal South Asian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Naitara Narayanan. All eyes were on Sri Lanka as the country held its ninth presidential election on the 21st of September. An important election as it was the first one since the economic crisis in 2022 and the popular uprising, or Aragalaya, that unseated the Rajapaksa brothers who were running the government at the time. After the election that went off into a runoff round of counting, Anura Kumara Dissanayake emerged the victor. Dissanayake belongs to the leftist party, the Janata Vimukti Peramuna, or JVP, and unlike other contenders in the race, does not have a political lineage. For many people, his victory symbolizes a break from long years of political corruption that crippled the country's economy, a break that the activists of the Aragalaya were calling for. But what does a Dissanayake presidency mean in terms of the country's immediate and long term challenges? What does it mean for Sri Lankans, whether Sinhala, Tamil, or Muslim? And what will a new government in Sri Lanka mean for the rest of South Asia? To examine these questions, I have as my guest today Ambika Satkunanathan, a lawyer and former Commissioner of Human Rights in Sri Lanka. Ambika, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you for having me on your show.
So, we're recording this on the 24th of September, just a day after Dissanayake has taken oath as president. What's the mood in Colombo at the moment?
Well, the mood in Colombo, well, it's quiet, and that was also one difference we saw is that in the past, after the winner was announced, there would have been firecrackers, fireworks, and this time it was really quiet. Of course, they also declared curfew soon after that night, and they extended it to the noon of the following day, the Sunday. But the mood here is quiet, and I think that for many people who voted for him and people from, for instance, the rural Sinhalese, for instance, for them it is because, as you correctly said, they wanted a change, they wanted a break from the past, and they saw both Sajid and Ranil as people who would in large parts continue not just the policies but also the practices, the culture, the relationships, the patronage, etc. But of course, what you see also is that I think there is this class panic, if I may say so, where the privileged people, perhaps they didn't expect him to win. They certainly did not want him to win. And now it is, you see on social media is where this is best evident is, for instance, he had tweeted something and when he had visited the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy, and they had used Google Translate, I think, to translate the tweet into English. And it said dental, apparently. So people are saying, oh, they can't even tweet in English. He doesn't know how to speak in English. So all those class prejudices clearly coming out. So we do have that as well. So I think there is hopefulness among certain people. There is cautiousness, perhaps fear amongst certain people, particularly with regard to the economy, etc. So it's a mixed mood, but it is calm.
Sure. Ambika, I'd just like to set up for our listeners, the conditions under which this election took place. And so in 2022, as we all know, Sri Lanka was plunged into its worst economic crisis brought on by unsustainable levels of debt due to absolutely disastrous policies by a government and president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and his brother, Mahinda, who was prime minister at the time. The Aragalaya, or the people's struggle, that resulted in the Rajapaksas resigning and even leaving Sri Lanka for a while, really called for a change in the culture of politics of Sri Lanka. Ranil Wickremesinghe, who first took over as Prime Minister under Gotabaya, And then, as president, he weathered calls for his own resignation and somehow engineered an economic recovery of the next 2 years. Of course, this is not a complete recovery. There are major sections of the population who are still suffering very much in this economic condition. And in a way, it's a very different election in Sri Lanka. It has been broadly free and fair and not marked by violence. And unlike before, it was actually a three-cornered race. In the past, Sri Lankan elections have only seen two top contenders. So this time, the three leading candidates were Wickramasinghe himself, who was the incumbent president and leader of the United National Party, the opposition leader, Sajith Premadasa from the Samagi Jana Balawigaya, or SJP, and Dissanayake of the JVP, which is part of the broader coalition called the National People's Power. So, having three contenders made it very difficult to predict. But in the last couple of weeks, Dissanayake did seem to pull ahead and, was capitalizing on the mood during the Aragalaya and the dissatisfaction in the couple of years after. But, the JVP itself has a contentious past because of the violent insurgencies that it was part of in the 1980s, where, many tens of thousands of people were killed. Dissanayake is trying to distance himself from that past. But also, there's a meteoric rise from having, the NPP coalition having only 3% of the vote in 2019 to now Dissanayake winning the presidency. So tell us about how he and the JVP are now perceived in Sri Lanka.
Well, I think, as you said, there because of their past, because of the fact there were two JVP insurrections in the 70s and then in the late 80s, and because of that, there is still a population, a segment of the population, but also largely they are urban, who, because of the violence the JVP perpetrated, there is concern about that, about, and that is what they say. If of the memories of late 80s, of 89, what happened, the fears. But then there is also, because of this, the NPP coalition, and because it's not just JVP, it is NPP, and you have people like Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, who has, since she came to parliament through the national list. The national list is a sort of a free or an additional bonus seat that political parties are given in parliament, depending on the percentage of seats they win. And usually the purpose of that is to bring to parliament someone with a particular expertise, someone who might not be able to win the popular vote. So Dr. Harini Amarasuriya came to parliament through a national list seat. Since then, her popularity has grown, also because she is not your typical politician. She's an academic. She speaks rationally. She does not engage in sort of dirty politics, mudslinging. She's measured. She gathers facts. She is factual, puts forward rational arguments. And therefore, she has grown in popularity. And I would say maybe people voted for him. There might be a segment also because of her, or largely due to her. So there is that hopefulness that they will be different. But that also means that you find there are also supporters, for instance, who valorize them, who act as if they can do no wrong, who try to perhaps whitewash the past. And on Twitter and on social media is where you see this play out. If someone makes a critical remark about them, then you find it's like a beehive that they, go and they attack. So you do find all that. And now even on chat groups, for instance, you tend to be on these various chat groups with hundreds of people, and you find they have very exacting standards. So for instance, he took oaths yesterday, and his maiden speech, there was conversation in one particular chat group about how that was not translated into Tamil. He spoke in Sinhala. The people who were there at the presidential secretariat had headphones that had simultaneous interpretation. But to those watching, it was not translated into Tamil. So therefore, if there is hope, it also means that you will be held to high standards. So I think the perception of JVP has also changed, because the business community, I think, was very wary of the JVP, also because of their leftist leanings, their politics, the remarks they've made in the past about the economy. But what we have seen Anura Kumara Dissanayake do over the last several months is reach out to the business community, have conversations with them, have conversations with economists. And he's also said that, he's plans to continue with the IMF program. So I think the perceptions have also changed over the last 12 months. Certainly, even let's take India, for instance. They were very anti Indian, and the remarks they've made, the positions they've taken, they've even engaged in protests. But we've seen that change as well, because we've seen Anura Kumara Dissanayake visit India, meet with the foreign minister, meet with the national security advisor. So certain perceptions remain the same. Certain people, I think, are playing a wait and see game, because there are people who've said, we voted for Ranil, but we do not want Anura to fail. We want him to win, so I'm hoping he makes the right decision. So it's a mixed bag, I would say.
Right. But are there concerns among Tamils and other ethnic minorities about his presidency? And do you think these are legitimate concerns? Because the JVP has had a kind of nationalist stance in the past, which can be interpreted as pro Sinhala.
Absolutely. I would say not even nationalists, they've been racist in the past. So, yes, there are concerns, particularly amongst the Tamil community, and those concerns are valid, because they were, and even now, even a few weeks before the elections, we saw Andhra Kumara Dissanayake saying that the Tamil people don't want justice. They only want the truth, and will set up a truth commission for them. We have seen him say, when he was in Jaffna in the conflict affected north, say that, tell the Tamil people, are you going to stand in the way of progress? Are you going to stand in the way of the wishes of the Sinhala community? Because they want change. They want us to come to power. That is sort of a veiled threat. And, it's not respecting the Tamil people and their choices. We've also seen Vijitha Herath, who is also, a member of parliament, part of the JVP, say that they're against the 13th Amendment, which actually came through the Indo-Lanka Accord, and that we do not need the provincial council as a solution for the ethnic conflict. The fact is, many Tamil people, or the Tamil community, has actually moved on from the 13th Amendment. What we're asking for now is federalism. So clearly, where the Tamil community, its aspirations are concerned, also where the solution to the ethnic conflict are concerned, there are deep concerns, and also accountability for all the violations that took place during the last stages of the war. And those are valid concerns.
Ambika, I want to ask you, for our listeners outside of Sri Lanka, very briefly, to tell us about the 13th Amendment and the mechanism of devolution of powers that entails.
So, I mean, the ethnic conflict is something that we've had for decades, and the Tamil politicians, the Tamil political parties, they engaged in talks with successive governments. There were various agreements that they entered into with the then, Sinhala governments, and those agreements were not honored, which is when, of course, in 1983, there were the ethnic riots. We saw armed groups come into being. There were several armed groups, but then the LTT emerged the victor, because they did so by also wiping out the other armed groups, the Tamil armed groups, with Tamil youth. And then in 1987, India negotiated what we call the Indo-Lanka Accord, which was about devolution to the provinces through provincial councils. But that, the 13th Amendment, so that how it was implemented is through an amendment to the Constitution, which is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, that was not fully implemented, because the 13th Amendment also devolves land and police powers, and that the government has never actually given. And if the JVP says that they think that even the provincial councils are not needed as a solution to the ethnic conflict, because the Tamils have always asked for more autonomy, which means devolution. So if they say even the limited devolution in the provincial councils is something that they do not agree with, then clearly federalism is just a pipe dream.
And so, what does that look like now under the Sanayaka presidency?
Well, right now we don't know, because there are a couple of things that have happened, and also something important that is going to happen, which is the UN Human Rights Council sessions have begun. The High Commissioner have presented his report on Sri Lanka. And also, we have a resolution on Sri Lanka, which requires Sri Lanka to do various things. Now, during the Yahapalana, or the Good Governance government, this was a resolution by consensus, which meant that the government agreed to the resolution and it was negotiated with the government. Then, of course, after Gotabaya Rajapaksa became president, they withdrew from the resolution. But the resolution continued nevertheless. Now, the resolution also set up an evidence gathering mechanism, which is called the Sri Lanka Accountability Project, which is housed within the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, that resolution comes to an end now. Right. So what they have negotiated, or in Geneva, the discussions have centered on what is called a rollover, which means all the provisions of the resolution will remain intact. It will merely be extended by 1 or 2 years. Right now, they're saying 1 year. Now, the government, I don't know, because we don't actually have a government now. The prime minister resigned, the cabinet stands dissolved, so we don't really have a government. So, what will the, hopefully, maybe by the end of the day, today or tomorrow, government, what will they do where the resolution is concerned? Will it be a consensus rollover, or will they disagree and will not agree to the rollover, in which case the resolution will have to go to vote at the UN Human Rights Council. And if it gets enough votes, then of course it can be rolled over. So that is also an important opportunity for us to see where does this government plan to go, where its engagement with multilateral institutions are concerned, where accountability, truth, and reconciliation are concerned. The second thing is the appointment. They've already started appointing secretaries to ministries, and the secretary to the Ministry of Defense is someone who is a former Air Force officer and who has very proudly said that he took part in, I think, 700 plus missions personally, which meant that clearly he would also be complicit in many of those incidents of shellings, bombings that the UN has found, multiple UN investigations have found to be in violation of international humanitarian law. So that is once again a cause for concern. The third thing is that if you looked at their campaign, they've actively tried to garner the support of military, because they've had these massive meetings with retired military officers. So clearly the military will continue to be, hopefully not, but realistically speaking, probably will be the sacred cow that
Right.
they will not touch. And if that happens, then clearly we also cannot address many of the issues that are of concerns to Tamils in particular, which is like, but it should be of concern to the entire population, because militarization is definitely in the north and the east, huge problem there, but also in the rest of the country in different ways.
Dissanayake and the JVP have been talking about establishing a new, clean political culture. Does it give any indication of what kind of government who might come in, who might be the main contenders in the general election coming up?
So the parliamentary elections, yes, that will be interesting for sure, because as we've seen with the presidential, the vote base is fractured. And if we have a JVP or an NPP president, and then if he doesn't not get enough votes to form a government, because we have a 225 seat parliament, then what happens? They will have to go into coalition government, but with which party will they go into coalition? It can only be the SJB, because we really do not want them to get into a coalition with the Sri Lanka Podujana Perumuna SLPP, which is the Rajapaksa party, or with UNP, which is the party of the former president Ranil Wickremesinghe. Because if they do, then it will be more of the same. And I can't imagine they would do with UNP. But so therefore, that is a concern. But maybe with this wave, who knows? Maybe they could garner a majority to form a government. So there is quite a bit of uncertainty there. And that uncertainty is of concern, because if you're going to form a national government or a coalition government, it would require a lot of time and negotiations. But we also don't have that, because we need to pass the appropriations bill and we need a resolution for that. So unless, of course, all the political parties come to an agreement and they agreed to, pass that. I mean, we don't know. It all depends, because if you do not pass the appropriation bill, that can also result in the dissolution of parliament, right? So there are all these moving parts that we have, and we really can't say. But the assumption here, or the talk in the circles here, is that of course they will appoint an interim government, which means they have three members in parliament, so they could divide the portfolios amongst the three members and the president, because the president can also hold portfolios. And they will appoint secretaries to all the ministries. They will dissolve parliament and hold elections, but it would still be, it's like we're cutting it fine, because we need to pass the appropriations bill.
Right. And these permutations and combinations that we might see in the parliamentary elections, of course, there were a lot of reconfiguration that happened in the run up to the presidential elections itself. And we'll talk about that in a bit, Ambika, but
Yes.
I want to ask you about the big challenge facing Dissanayake, which is really still the economy, right? Wickramasinghe did a fairly decent job, through the worst of the crisis. But there is this long tail of the crisis. There are austerity measures that have been imposed by the International Monetary Fund as conditions for the $3 billion bailout package that it is giving Sri Lanka. Tell us what this looks like on the ground and what this new president will now have to take on.
Well, on the ground, we see, the central bank announces that they brought down inflation. Well, I'm not challenging their figures. I'm not an economist. I believe in
Mm.
sticking to my lane. So, yes, you say you've reduced it, fine. But what we also see, and research has been done, there's, for instance, Advocata Institute has done this, and we have the figures, and we know it through practice, is that despite the inflation going down, prices have not come down, prices of goods, and which means that people's purchasing power has not increased. At the same time, their salaries have not increased, because there were many companies, institutions, even through the economic crisis, did not increase salaries, which means that for the average person, they're still facing difficulty meeting their basic needs. And that is a problem, because it can affect health, it can affect children's education, malnutrition. We have plenty of reports by the World Food Program, by UNICEF, etc., with evidence how this has impacted. So, for President Dissanayake, how is he going to deal with this, to address the needs and concerns? Because this is one of the reasons why many were angry with Wickramasinghe, because they just kept saying, "Oh, inflation has decreased," without looking at how has it actually impacted on the ground. Has people's purchasing power changed? Are they able to now eat better meals? Are they able to buy protein? These are all important questions which President Wickramasinghe did not care about. And so, therefore, how will they address these? The other is, of course, one of the measures required is to trim bloated public service. And that's a fact, because historically, different governments have dispensed patronage through government jobs. This is not new in South Asia. We're all familiar with it. And the result is, of course, a massive bloated public service. Now, if you look at in Sri Lanka, the postal votes are counted first. The postal votes are what the state sector employees are the ones who vote, because if they're going for election duty and they can't vote, they vote through postal votes. And always the postal votes have been an indicator of who ultimately wins. Right. And this time, clearly, it was AKD. So they may have also voted for AKD because they thought if it was Ranil Wickramasinghe or Sajith Premadasa, then they would trim the public service and they would all lose their jobs. And maybe because of the leftist, values, ethos of the party, their background, that they would not do this. Maybe that is why they voted for them. So how do you trim? That is when you get strikes and you get a lot of, if he's talking about public sector reform or just general reform, reforming the state structure, if the public sector starts to undermine it, I know this very well, being on the Human Rights Commission for 5 years, when the public sector has the ability to undermine reforms in ways that we will not even catch up, right? Because the bureaucracy is massive, and by the time you figure it out, it is way too late. So then how is he going to handle that? Also, because he and people in his party have no experience running anything, right? And that can be a good thing, in that you don't have entrenched bad practices and, these dysfunctional practices. But it's also a bad thing because experience does also give you a bit of, wisdom, and you learn. There are learnings. You will not make mistakes. So I think it is a positive and a negative. One of the positives, though, is that in his speech he said, I'm not a magician and I don't know everything. I want to acquire the knowledge and bring in experts. Now, this has been criticized by people who says, "Oh, is he going to come and learn on the job, etc." But I would say it's a good thing because no politician, no president knows everything. They actually make huge mistakes because they think they know everything and they disregard specialist advice. So if he is aware, self-aware about what he does not know and brings in experts, not friends and family, not people who support the NPP only, but others who know what they're doing, experts in the subject, and listens to them, then he can be successful. But the fact that this is being criticized also shows that the executive presidency is a problem. And it also has changed the psyche of Sri Lankans, where we think that if you're the president, then you must, like this strong man, you need to know you need to know everything, and you don't need advice, and you need to be able to solve everything and be a magician, which goes to the point we really need to also abolish the executive presidency. And they promised to do that. They've said this is the last executive president that Sri Lanka will elect. It's a lovely sound bite, but we're hoping that they will be able
Right.
to
There
do
have been
that.
attempts in the past, but they really haven't worked out, have they?
Yeah, exactly, they have not worked
Yeah.
out.
But like you mentioned, he comes from a leftist party. He has promised to make, major tax cuts and boost public welfare. But these are also, somewhat at odds with the conditions of the IMF bailout. In the early days of the campaign, he was talking about completely renegotiating the IMF package, but that he seems to have dialed down in the later part of his run for president. And now, they're saying that no, we will not tear up the IMF agreement and we will, follow it. But what does it look like on the ground? Are things going to continue as they were in that regard?
Well, we have to take him at his word because, as I said, we don't
Hmm.
actually have a government, right? And one would assume that he would. But as you said, tax cuts. What we need is people do need to pay tax, but the tax has to be equitable. The fact that you need to increase the thresholds, because when people's purchasing power is lower, the prices have not gone down, and you start taxing everyone who earns 100,000 rupees and who may have a family to support and two kids, that is really pushing them also into poverty. So the tax has to be equitable, right? So even in terms of wealth tax or property tax, and these are all things that people are like, oh my god, no, it's so anti-capitalist and we
Hmm.
must not do that. But it has to be equitable. The taxation now is not equitable, right? But where supporting social services are concerned, that is something even the IMF says, right, that they are for ensuring that the poorest of the poor, marginalized communities are not adversely impacted. So that is something that I feel like, where in comparison to President Ranil Wickremesinghe, that is a positive thing, because we do our health services, our primary health care is great. But we have found during the economic crisis, the health service has gone, it has sort of broken down. Even doctors have come out publicly on social media to talk about the fact that they still don't have supplies, the fact that so many doctors are migrated, the fact that they don't have nurses, etc. So we do need to pay attention to that. But also, what is his economic plan? We can't just rely on taxation and tourism, right? We need to also build an export economy. So how are you going to do that? Are you talking to experts? He should. Whose advice are you taking? Those factors are all important, but we don't know yet what is happening because no statements have been made in that regard, no action taken yet. I think they're still trying to form the government or the interim government or the government until we have elections, and probably dissolve parliament and hold general elections.
Right. I'd like to take a moment just to remind our listeners that at Himal, we've been covering Sri Lanka for the last 35 years. And in the run up to the election, we published two very good pieces that will really help you understand this moment in Sri Lanka. One was about how different this presidential election was. It's a piece called Sri Lanka Enters a Presidential Election Like No Other Before It by Malin Aryasinghe. And we also had another piece by our contributor Tisarani Gunasekara on how Ranil Wickremesinghe became Sri Lanka's unlikely repairman. And this really charts both Wickremesinghe's career and the trajectory of Sri Lanka's politics over decades. To produce this in-depth and independent coverage of the whole of South Asia along with Sri Lanka, we at Himal rely on listeners like you. So support our work, which will help us bring you more stories and produce more podcasts like this one. You can become a patron of the magazine by clicking on the link in the episode notes or by going to our website and clicking Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our latest stories, events, and more. You'll see a sign up link to our newsletters also in the episode notes. Now, back to our conversation with Ambika Satkunanathan. Ambika, I want to talk about the other two contenders in this race because it says so much about Sri Lanka's politics at this moment. Wickremesinghe was the incumbent president going into this election. He positioned himself as the man who steered the economy through the crisis, and which, in all fairness, he did. But he got only about 17% of the vote. Was that a rejection of Wickremesinghe himself, or was it a rejection of the Rajapaksas since he had been seen to be their man in the past, even if he did kind of defang them going into these elections?
I would say maybe a bit of both because he also has a history of being
Mm.
rejected by the public. When he's contested for the presidency, he's been rejected. When even last time, even in the parliamentary elections, right? Because they got only a national list seat. And then he came to parliament using that national list seat. Also because during the when the Aragalaya was going on, what has been said by many members of parliament is that the opposition came together and they had an agreement and a plan on how they were going to form a government, how they would get Gotabaya to resign, etc. And that Ranil also knew, he agreed, but then he reneged on the agreement and he went
Mm.
solo, he went rogue and negotiated with the Rajapaksas and became the prime minister. And then when Gotabaya resigned, became the president because he had the backing of the Rajapaksa family's party, which is the SLPP. So I think that is also the fact that a lot of people are angry about the way he behaved during the good governance government, which we felt was a chance to
And this
make
was the
things better.
Sirisena government,
Um,
right? Under president. Yeah.
with Sirisena when he was prime minister and Sirisena was president, the way that and also the corruption, the fact that he ignored the corruption at the central bank, the bond scam as we call it, he ignored that. People feel that he protected the Rajapaksas during that regime so that no legal action could be taken against them, and then again so strongly aligned with the Rajapaksas. But still, even after that, this is personal experience, there are various people who supported him. But what happened is that he became authoritarian, or he started behaving. We don't know whether he probably had those tendencies, but he started behaving in an authoritarian manner. And he went after the Constitutional Council. He even went after the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court delivered a determination which he did not like. That is the point when it shifted for many people, because there were some lawyers who said, well, when he went after the Supreme Court, they're like, okay, now this is where we draw the line. So clearly showing that he is an authoritarian. He allowed his then Minister of Public Security, Tiran Alas, run riot in the name of an anti-drug operation, which saw mass violations of human rights. We saw him allowing the Online Safety Act, if implemented fully, will curtail freedom of expression, assembly, all that. So therefore, clearly an authoritarian. So I think it is, and of course, the fact that they feel that he has no empathy. Now, many who voted for AKD, as we call him, Anura Kumara Dissanayake, AKD, because Ranil Wickremesinghe has shown that he doesn't care about the people, right? It's about their suffering, etc. That lack of empathy, not caring about the poor, not caring about the people, and the arrogance, which became increasingly visible the longer he sat in that chair. I think all those factors cumulatively are what resulted in that
And
showing
also
at the
perhaps the
polls.
crackdown on the Aragalaya protesters themselves.
That also, that immediately, he actually supported them, and he made remarks in support. The moment he becomes president, in less than 24 hours later, he removes the structures using violence. What was the need? Because they had already agreed to leave that day. But they brought in the military along with STF and police and perpetrated violence against them, which was completely unnecessary and a total just show
Mm.
of force.
In 2022, before this people's uprising, the Rajapaksa family had quite the stranglehold over Sri Lanka's politics. Gotabaya as president, Mahinda as prime minister, their younger brother Basil as the minister of finance. And in this election, in fact, there's one contender that is not talked about because he was not a front runner, and he's a Rajapaksa. Namal Rajapaksa was
Mhm.
Mahinda's son, who did not get
Mhm.
the backing of many people in his party, the SLPP, and got only 3% of the vote. Again, a rejection of the Rajapaksas?
Absolutely. And it's a rejection because you look at Hambantota. Hambantota district was their
Right.
stronghold, right? But he's not even made a dent there, because there it is once again, the usual Sajid AKD Ranil. They're the ones who got the chunk of the votes. And in their stronghold itself, they have been rejected. And of course, on social media, you see people rejoicing, some really happy about that. So I think it is a rejection and also perhaps a change that we see in the public, where they don't blindly follow families or leaders, and they start to ask more questions, and they don't listen to politicians and cast their vote. That is another thing I think that this election shows us, is the fact that it's fractured. People, some are mourning about it, it would so fractured, but sometimes it shows you need that to grow, and the fracture itself shows growth. That, so I think we need to examine that with more
Mm.
nuanced eye.
And that brings us to Sajid Premadasa. He actually got the highest share of the Tamil vote, with the Tamil majority districts giving him about 41%. And in these regions, AKD or Dissanayake actually came in third after Vikramasinghe.
Mhm. Yeah.
Again, there's been a lot of reconfiguration with a Tamil candidate also being put forward. Tell us what happened there.
Yeah, well, we had the Tamil common candidate because they formed what is called common council, like Poduchabai they called it, and which had politicians, civil society, academics, and they decided internally on the candidate, and they decided on him. Of course, then the ITAC, which was the main party of the Tamil Alliance, the Tamil National Alliance, said that they would support the Sajid Premadasa, but there was conflict there as well, because you had the leader of the party saying that he wouldn't, but whereas the Central Committee had made the decision, so conflict
Mm.
again there. You also had one of the senior members of the party publicly after voting coming out and saying the first vote was in line with the party, which means he voted for Sajid. The second vote was for the Tamil people, which means second preference he must have given to the common candidate. And the third, he says publicly, rather shamelessly, it was for
Mm.
Ranil Wickremesinghe. And you're flabbergasted, wondering what sort of thinking went into it. There were also a lot of rumors about pressures, about favors that were given to various MPs to try to force them to support Ranil Wickremesinghe, and so that the MPs were torn between the Tamil candidate, and they'd receive favors from all these rumors within society. But I think what it shows once again, the fracture, is that there were people who voted for the Tamil common candidate because who got 200 plus votes, because they were also sick of voting for the lesser evil. If you look at historically, even when Mahinda Rajapaksa and Sarath Fonseca, right? Sarath Fonseca is someone who led the war. So, what sort of calculations would a community have gone through, and what sort of pain and anguish they would have gone through to think we need to get rid of the Rajapaksas? So, let's vote for Fonseca and then we'll see. That is how the Tamil community has always voted. We have voted looking at the lesser evil. And sometimes it's really hard to figure out who the lesser evil is. Even now, the vote for Sajid, I don't know whether it's a vote for Sajid or it is a vote against Rav Vikramasinghe. Is it a vote for the lesser evil if you look at all of them? The person who voted for Sajid may have thought, there's no point voting for the Tamil common candidate because he's not going to win. Let me vote for the lesser evil who can win and maybe won't be so bad. But then you have people who feel like we're just sick of voting for the lesser evil. We want to vote for our candidate, someone from our community. It does not matter. I want to symbolically show this is what I think. They may have voted for the Tamil common candidate. And of course, there are people who still voted for Ranil Wickremesinghe. I quite haven't figured that one out yet, but it might also be you find the Tamils in Colombo, for instance, the more privileged Tamils, they have always supported Ranil Wickremesinghe. So it's hard to say what, because if you look at the votes here, Kites is the islands. That is where one of the parliamentarians, Tamil politicians, who's always been aligned with the government, even through successive governments, called Douglas Devananda. That is his stronghold. He threw his support with Wickremesinghe. But in Kites, it is the Tamil common candidate who's won, right? So that doesn't really make sense. And then, of course, you have Ranil Wickremesinghe. And even in Batticaloa district, for instance, in the eastern province, now that is where the Tamil common candidate comes from. But there, it is Sajid Premadasa who's polled for 43.66%, and the Tamil common candidate in his hometown area has polled only 11.58%. So, how do you make sense of that? Right? So, there are a lot of shifts happening. I think it is because people are exhausted, they're sick of it, they're angry, they're also thinking more. And they are making calculations, political calculations. And when that happens, you are going to get fractions. Votes are going to break up. And there might also be the concern, though, is that if you have the Tamil political parties losing ground in the north and the east, then who is going to come in? Is it going to be someone aligned with a regressive force, with a racist force? And if so, then what happens? Because representation in parliament for those regions by people from those regions to speak of the interests of those people, that is important. And that might be adversely affected by all this infighting, which is at its peak.
And what is the understanding of why Dissanayake didn't do well? Is it just that the JVP doesn't have so much of a presence in the North and East?
That is because there is fear. There is fear of due to their racist past, because they were against the peace process. In 2002, they were aligned with the Rajapaksas. They were for the war. They're against provincial councils, etc., etc. The history of their racism, of their anti-Tamil action, of their anti, negotiated settlement action, their pro-war stance, those factors are why he polls so low in the Tamil
Right.
majority areas.
The other community that's had a rough time of it after the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings, there was a lot of backlash against Muslims, and especially during the pandemic. Is there an
Yep.
understanding of what their concerns were going into the election and how they actually voted?
The concern would be one, of course, the concerns of everyone else, but also the continuing in some ways, there is the anti Muslim sentiment is also not new. It has existed for a long time. It became more visible during the Rajapaksa era when they started attacking Muslim businesses. So, a lot of it is jealousy about economic prosperity. Then you had the Easter Sunday attacks, after which we saw mass arrests, discrimination also by the Tamil community
Right.
of the Muslim community. When I was at the commission, we got received complaints about Muslim traders who had been at Tamil markets in the Tamil areas in the eastern province, who were then told you
Right.
can't come here anymore after the Easter Sunday attacks. So the Tamils also, and of course the Tamils, as you know, historically the expulsion of the Muslims from the north, etc. But so it has been there, and then of course the forced cremation during the pandemic. But in society, we do see this anti-Muslim sentiment still existing, and for them, I suppose the fear that it could happen again. Right, the anti-Muslim sentiment could go on the rise because during elections, during Gotabaya's election, presidential, the anti-minority, anti-Muslim rhetoric was definitely the anti-Tamil, anti-Muslim. So those fears, for sure, they would have had those fears as well, absolutely. And they would also be looking for someone who is not going to, and that is one of the things that was quite low. We didn't see much of it, or barely, is the using the ethnic card
Mm.
during these elections. The candidates did not do that.
Ambika, just looking at the larger region now, what do you see are the implications of this election and this new president on South Asia as a whole? And let's start with India, for instance. You mentioned that he was seen as anti-India earlier. He's seen as closer to China. There are some concerns in India about that.
Mhm.
But how legitimate are these? Is there going to be a kind of reconfiguration in Sri Lanka's foreign policy? I know, and in relation to its neighbors.
I don't know what the internal discussions are, but
Mm.
outwardly, at least, the fact that AKD visited India and met, as I said, with the National Security Advisor, the Foreign Minister, and clearly showed that he wanted to, during that visit and afterwards, the way he portrayed it, the way that the JV or the NPP portrayed it was in a positive light. It's like saying we have evolved, we have moved, and we want to build good relations. And during his speech yesterday as well, that is something that he said. We want to work with everyone, we want to work with the world, we have many challenges. And also, going back to this whole Marxist thing and everything is going to burn, he also in his speech said we need the entrepreneurs and we need the
Mm.
business community to come and work with us. So therefore, it appears they have perhaps grown, evolved. It is really hard to say because we have nothing much to go on except the past. But now they are in government, or he is president, and they have to form an interim government. Therefore, I suppose we will see where, through the actions. But outwardly, no, outwardly there does not seem to be a reason for
Sure.
concern.
Well, finally, Ambika, I just want to ask you for three recommendations to our listeners to understand this moment in Sri Lanka better. So these could be books or movies or podcasts. What would you recommend to our listeners right now?
One movie that I recently saw, which was
Okay.
called Paradise. It also has like Sri Lankan actors, Indian actors. Dice. It was released last year. So it's a young Indian couple who become tourists in Sri Lanka during the economic crisis because they say things were really cheap and they could afford it. So it has parts of it. You see parts of Sri Lanka's history, the class struggle, you see the protests, you get some of the politics. But what comes through also is the normalization of violence, of brutality, because there's
Mm.
police torture there. And the ending is actually quite surprising, but it'll make you curious. It is tantalizing in the sense it opens little doors into various aspects of Sri Lanka that you probably want to explore. And it encapsulates everything, I think.
Well, Ambika, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you.
That was Ambika Satkunanathan on the State of South Asia podcast. You can read her analysis for Himal on how Sri Lanka continued to militarize the state despite the Rajapaksa's fall. You'll find that story and a lot more on Sri Lanka in the episode notes and on our website himalmag.com. You can also listen to the South Asia Review of Books podcast hosted by Shweta Srikantan. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes and to share, rate, and review them. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nayantara Narayanan. Thank you for listening and see you then.